My name is Ethan Caldwell. I'm 36 years old, and I teach literature at a high school in Portland. My life has always been fairly quiet, the kind of quiet that most people overlook without realizing it exists. I'm the sort of person who prefers a book over a crowded party, who listens more than he talks, and who finds comfort in routines that most people would probably call boring. A lot of that probably started when I was a kid, because growing up in my family meant learning very quickly that there wasn't much room for more than one loud voice in the house. My older sister Rachel filled that space completely. Rachel was 3 years older than me, and from the moment she learned how to talk, it seemed like she never stopped. She had this natural ability to pull attention toward herself without even trying, although she definitely tried most of the time. When she walked into a room, people noticed. When she told a story, it somehow became louder, bigger, and more dramatic than whatever had actually happened. She had a way of turning ordinary moments into performances, and for some reason our family seemed to reward that. Dinner conversations were never really conversations when we were kids. They were usually Rachel speaking, Rachel complaining, Rachel laughing loudly about something that happened at school while my parents nodded along like they were watching a show they had already paid for. I remember sitting there quietly with my plate, occasionally trying to say something about a book I was reading or a project from school, but my voice would just kind of dissolve into the background noise before anyone really heard it. At first I thought maybe I just needed to speak louder. That seemed like the logical solution when you're a kid. So I tried it a few times, forcing my voice above the chaos of Rachel's latest story about some minor drama with her friends. But every attempt felt unnatural, like trying to act in a play that someone else had already cast. Rachel always managed to reclaim the spotlight within seconds anyway, either by interrupting or by escalating whatever story she was telling into something bigger. Eventually I stopped trying. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There wasn't some big moment where I realized I had been overshadowed. It was more like a slow adjustment, the way your eyes gradually get used to a dark room. I figured out that life was a lot easier if I just stayed quiet and focused on my own things. Books became my escape early on. While Rachel was busy creating chaos in the living room or talking endlessly on the phone with her friends, I spent most of my time in my room reading anything I could get my hands on. My parents seemed happy enough with that arrangement. A quiet kid who stayed out of trouble was convenient, especially when they were already exhausted from managing Rachel's constant energy. Rachel, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on attention the way some people thrive on oxygen. School events, family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, it didn't matter what the occasion was. She found a way to make herself the center of it. If someone else received praise, she found a way to redirect the conversation. If someone told a story, she somehow had a bigger one. Looking back now, as an adult, I can see that it wasn't always malicious. A lot of it probably came from insecurity or a need to feel important. But when you're a kid living next to that kind of personality every single day, it just feels exhausting. Teachers loved Rachel because she was charismatic and outspoken. Relatives adored her because she was entertaining. Meanwhile, I was the quiet kid who sat in the corner reading, the one people described with words like polite, calm, or mature for his age. Those sound like compliments, but they're also the kinds of words people use when they don't really know what else to say about you. The funny thing is that I never actually hated Rachel growing up. Frustrated sometimes, sure, but not hateful. She was still my sister, and there were moments when her energy could even be fun. Every once in a while, she would pull me into one of her elaborate imaginary games or convince me to help her rehearse some dramatic speech she planned to give at school. During those rare moments, when the spotlight wasn't being used as a weapon, but more like a stage light we both happened to be standing under, she could actually be pretty great. But those moments never lasted long. Rachel always drifted back toward the spotlight eventually, and I always drifted back toward the quiet corners of the room. Over time, that dynamic became so normal that nobody questioned it anymore, including me. Rachel was the loud one. I was the quiet one. That was just how things worked in our family. By the time I reached high school, I had completely embraced that role. I focused on school, on reading, on writing essays that my teachers seemed to appreciate more than anyone else did. Literature made sense to me in a way people often didn't. Characters in books had motivations, arcs, consequences. Stories had structure. Real life, especially life with Rachel constantly turning everything into a spectacle, felt much messier still. That contrast shaped who I became. While Rachel chased attention and excitement, I learned to observe, to listen, and to notice the small details most people missed. In a strange way, living in her shadow forced me to develop the very traits that eventually led me toward teaching literature. I spent years watching human behavior from the sidelines, like someone studying characters in a novel. Back then, though, I didn't think of it in such thoughtful terms. At the time, it simply felt like survival. In a house where the loudest voice always won, the easiest way to exist was to stop competing for volume altogether and quietly build a life in the background. By the time Rachel and I reached adulthood, the differences between us had only become more obvious. The patterns that started in childhood didn't disappear when we grew older, they just evolved into more complicated versions of the same dynamic. Rachel was still chasing attention, excitement, and validation from wherever she could find it, while I was quietly building something stable and predictable for myself. After high school, Rachel went off to college with the same dramatic energy she had always carried. Our parents talked about it like it was the beginning of some incredible future, like she was destined for something extraordinary simply because she had always been the loudest voice in the room. I remember watching everyone celebrate her departure like it was the first chapter of an inspiring story. The problem was that Rachel had never really been interested in finishing anything she started. Within a year, she had already changed majors twice, each time announcing the decision with the same passionate certainty that this new direction was the one that would finally match her true potential. Every conversation about her life sounded like a speech, filled with big ideas about success and recognition, but none of it seemed to last very long. A few months later, the enthusiasm would disappear, replaced by complaints about professors who didn't understand her, classmates who were supposedly jealous of her, or systems that she claimed were designed to hold creative people like her back. Eventually, she dropped out completely. The announcement came during a family dinner that somehow turned into another one of Rachel's dramatic monologues. She framed it like a brave act of independence, explaining that college was too limiting for someone with her ambition. She talked about business ideas, creative projects, and opportunities she was supposedly going to pursue instead. Our parents looked worried, but supportive, nodding along as if they believed every word. Meanwhile, I had started taking a very different path. I stayed in school, not because it felt glamorous or exciting, but because it made sense. I worked 2 part-time jobs while studying, one at a small bookstore and another tutoring younger students in English after classes. My schedule was exhausting most days, and there were plenty of nights when I fell asleep over textbooks or stacks of essays, but there was something satisfying about the structure of it all. Every semester completed, every bill paid, every small step forward felt like a quiet victory that only I really noticed. Rachel, of course, had plenty to say about that. Whenever we talked, usually during family gatherings or holidays, she treated my choices like they were some kind of sad compromise. She had a habit of leaning back in her chair with this half-amused expression and making comments that sounded like jokes, but carried a sharp edge underneath. Teaching, according to Rachel, was the kind of job people took when their dreams failed. She said it casually once during a holiday dinner, laughing like it was an obvious truth that everyone should agree with. In her mind, teaching was something safe, predictable, and small. It didn't involve fame, recognition, or the kind of attention she believed a successful life required. She couldn't understand why someone would willingly choose a career that didn't place them in the spotlight. I never argued with her about it. By that point, I had already learned that debates with Rachel usually turned into performances where she tried to dominate the conversation rather than actually listen. Instead, I simply continued doing what I had always done, focusing on my own path without worrying too much about her opinions. After graduating, I eventually became a high school literature teacher in Portland. The job wasn't glamorous in the way Rachel defined success, but it was meaningful in a way that mattered to me. Every day, I spent hours talking with students about stories, characters, and the strange ways people try to understand their lives through words. Some days were chaotic, some students were difficult, but there was a quiet satisfaction in watching someone suddenly understand a book that had once confused them. Outside of school, I had another routine that almost nobody in my family took seriously. In the evenings, after grading papers or preparing lessons, I spent time writing. It started as something small, just a habit I developed over the years. I wrote late at night at my kitchen table with a laptop and a cup of coffee, slowly building a story that only existed in my head for a long time. It wasn't glamorous work. There were nights when I stared at the screen for an hour without typing anything meaningful, and there were entire chapters that eventually got deleted because they didn't work. But I loved the process. Writing felt like a quiet extension of everything I'd spent my life observing. The same attention to human behavior that helped me teach literature also helped me create characters and situations that felt real. It took years to finish the manuscript because I never rushed it. I treated it like something personal rather than something meant to impress anyone. Rachel, however, never missed an opportunity to mock it. Whenever the subject came up, usually because our parents mentioned it with cautious pride, Rachel would laugh and refer to it as my cute little hobby. She talked about it the same way someone might talk about a friend who spends weekends painting landscapes that will never hang in a gallery. According to her, writing a novel while working as a teacher sounded like the perfect example of someone who had quietly accepted a life without real success. The irony of that opinion became clear much later. After years of writing, editing, rewriting, and doubting whether the story was even worth finishing, I eventually sent the manuscript to a small literary agent. I didn't expect much from it. At that point, it simply felt like the natural final step after spending so many evenings working on something that had become part of my routine. What happened next was something I never really planned for. The book was picked up by a publisher, and the contract they offered was worth $420,000. For most people, that would have been the kind of announcement Rachel spent her entire life chasing. For me, it felt less like a dramatic breakthrough and more like the quiet result of years spent working patiently in the background, exactly the way I had always done things. The moment everything finally collapsed between Rachel and me happened during what was supposed to be one of the happiest evenings of my father's life. He had spent more than 30 years working for the same engineering firm in Denver, slowly building a reputation as someone reliable, patient, and quietly competent. Unlike Rachel, my father had never been interested in attention or applause. He was the kind of man who preferred steady work and a calm home over recognition, which was probably one of the reasons I always understood him better than most people in our family seemed to. When he announced his retirement, my mother decided to organize a celebration dinner in Denver so friends, relatives, and a few of his longtime coworkers could attend. It wasn't meant to be a huge event, just a comfortable gathering at a nice restaurant with good food and people who had known him for years. I flew in from Portland the day before, and for most of the afternoon leading up to the dinner, I felt a quiet sense of pride, knowing that the evening was meant to recognize the kind of steady life my father had built. Rachel, of course, arrived late. She made her entrance the way she always did, loud enough to be noticed from across the room before anyone had even seen her. Conversations paused as she swept through the restaurant, greeting people dramatically, hugging relatives she hadn't spoken to in months, laughing loudly like the entire evening had been organized for her personal entertainment. I watched from my seat near the end of the table while she moved through the room like someone stepping onto a stage she believed she owned. At first, I tried not to think too much about it. Rachel had always been like this, and I had spent most of my life learning how to exist around that energy without letting it pull me into unnecessary conflict. The dinner continued normally for a while. People shared stories about my father's career, his coworkers told a few funny anecdotes from years at the office, and my mother looked happier than I had seen her in a long time. For a brief moment, the night actually felt peaceful. Then Rachel noticed a microphone the restaurant staff had set up near the front of the room for speeches. At some point halfway through dinner, just as dessert plates were being placed on the tables, she suddenly stood up, walked toward the microphone, and tapped it with her fingernail to get everyone's attention. The sharp sound cut through the quiet conversations instantly. Chairs turned, forks paused in midair, and dozens of eyes shifted toward her as she smiled like someone who had been waiting all evening for exactly this moment. She began with what sounded like a sincere speech about our father, talking about how hard-working he had always been and how proud she was of everything he had accomplished. At first it seemed harmless, almost touching, and I remember thinking that maybe she had finally learned how to let someone else be the center of attention for once. But with Rachel, the spotlight always drifted back to her eventually. Within a few minutes, the speech had already shifted. She started telling exaggerated stories about growing up, focusing mostly on herself and the way she believed she had inherited our father's supposed ambition and drive. People laughed politely, although the tone of the room had started to change slightly. It was the kind of laughter that sounded more like obligation than genuine amusement. I sat quietly at the table, watching the familiar pattern unfold. Rachel's voice grew louder as she spoke, her gestures becoming wider and more theatrical, like she was performing for an audience rather than speaking at a family dinner. Every few sentences, she paused for dramatic effect, glancing around the room to make sure people were paying attention. The longer she spoke, the less the speech had to do with my father's retirement. Then she looked directly at me. I remember the exact moment because her smile changed slightly, the way it always did when she sensed an opportunity for one of her jokes at someone else's expense. She pointed in my direction with the microphone still in her hand, and I felt every person at the table turn their heads toward me at the same time. Her voice carried easily across the room. She laughed and said that while she was out chasing bigger ambitions, Ethan was still teaching high school. Then she added the line that made the room fall completely silent. She asked if anyone could imagine spending their entire life grading essays. The laughter she expected never really came. A few people forced small chuckles out of politeness, but most of the room simply went quiet in that uncomfortable way that happens when someone says something they shouldn't have said in public. I could feel the weight of dozens of awkward glances moving between Rachel and me, as if people were waiting to see how I would react. I didn't react at all. Years of living with Rachel had taught me that responding to those kinds of comments only encouraged her. Silence was usually the most effective way to let her words collapse under their own weight. Still, sitting there in that moment, I felt something shift inside me that had been building slowly for a long time. The joke wasn't even particularly creative. Rachel had made variations of that same comment for years, always treating my career like it was some kind of sad compromise compared to the dramatic future she believed she deserved. Normally, I would have ignored it the way I always did. But this time the room felt different. This was supposed to be my father's night, a celebration of a man who had spent decades quietly supporting his family without demanding recognition. Instead, Rachel had once again turned the spotlight toward herself and used it to mock someone else. The silence that followed her comment stretched longer than she expected. Even Rachel seemed to notice the tension eventually, her confident expression wavering slightly. As she looked around the room for the reaction, she had imagined my father sat at the head of the table with a polite smile that looked painfully forced. My mother stared down at her plate, and I sat there calmly, realizing that the quiet role I had played in our family for most of my life had finally reached its breaking point. The rest of the evening after Rachel's comment drifted forward in that strange, uncomfortable way social events sometimes do when something unpleasant has already happened, but everyone is pretending it didn't. Conversations restarted, plates were cleared, and people tried to return their attention to my father, but the energy in the room had shifted. I kept my usual calm expression and continued eating my dessert, answering a few quiet questions from one of my father's coworkers about teaching, but inside I felt a dull exhaustion that had nothing to do with travel or the long day. Rachel, meanwhile, behaved as if nothing unusual had occurred. She laughed loudly with relatives, refilled her wine glass more than once, and continued drifting between tables, collecting attention wherever she could find it. Watching her from across the room felt strangely familiar, like observing a performance I had seen too many times to count. By the time the dinner ended and people began saying their goodbyes, most of the tension had settled into that polite silence families sometimes adopt when no one wants to reopen a conflict in public. I helped my parents gather a few decorations and leftover cards while guests slowly filtered out of the restaurant. Rachel disappeared for a while, then reappeared near the entrance just as I was about to leave. She approached me with that same confident expression she always wore when she believed she was about to uncover something entertaining. Her smile wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile someone uses when they already think they know the answer to a question. She asked if we could talk for a second. Not wanting to cause another scene in front of our parents, I followed her outside into the cool night air behind the restaurant. Denver evenings had that dry chill that makes every sound feel a little sharper, and for a moment we just stood there under the dim light from the parking lot. Rachel crossed her arms and studied me with exaggerated curiosity. Then she asked the question. She said that my book deal wasn't actually real, right? Her tone carried that same mocking disbelief she had used for years whenever my writing came up in conversation. It wasn't curiosity. It was accusation disguised as humor, like she had already decided the entire thing must be some kind of exaggeration. I told her calmly that it wasn't any of her business. The answer clearly annoyed her because she immediately leaned closer, narrowing her eyes as if she expected me to crack under pressure. Rachel had always believed that persistence could force the truth out of people, mostly because she assumed everyone else operated the same way she did. She started asking questions about the publisher, the contract, the amount of money, each one delivered with a tone that made it clear she didn't actually believe me. I repeated the same answer in slightly different forms, explaining that my professional agreements were private and that I had no intention of discussing them with her. After a few minutes, she laughed and shrugged, like the whole conversation had only been a joke. She said something about how people exaggerate things all the time and walked back toward the parking lot as if she had lost interest. I assumed that would be the end of it. I flew back to Portland the next morning and returned to my usual routine at school. The week moved forward quietly, filled with classes, grading papers, and preparing lesson plans. The events in Denver slowly faded into the background the way family conflicts often do once distance separates everyone again. 2 days later, something happened that completely changed how I viewed my sister. I was sitting at my kitchen table in the evening, answering a few emails from my literary agent when my phone rang. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. The moment I answered, I could hear that same smug satisfaction in her voice that she used when she believed she had uncovered some kind of secret. She began casually mentioning details about my publishing contract. Not general things someone might guess, but very specific information. She referenced the exact advance amount, the payment schedule, and even a clause about international translation rights that had only been discussed in the official document my publisher sent through email. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood what she was saying. Then she repeated one of the numbers from the contract word for word. There was only one place that information existed. Inside my private email. The realization hit me slowly at first, then all at once in a cold wave of disbelief. I asked her where she had seen those details, and instead of denying anything, she simply laughed. It wasn't nervous laughter or embarrassment. It was the confident laugh of someone who believed they had just proven a point. She said she knew I was lying earlier because the numbers seemed too precise for someone who was supposedly trying to hide the truth. Then she casually admitted that she had checked my email. The way she described it made my stomach tighten. She explained it like it was a clever trick, like she had simply solved a puzzle. Somehow she had managed to access my account and open the email containing the publishing contract. She had read through the entire document just to verify that I wasn't making the whole thing up. The conversation stopped feeling real for a moment. I sat there at my kitchen table, staring at the wall, while she continued talking, listing off details from the contract like someone reciting facts they had memorized from a file. Every sentence confirmed the same disturbing reality. Rachel had violated my privacy in the most direct way possible. She hadn't done it out of concern or curiosity. She had done it because she wanted proof that I wasn't lying about something she believed I couldn't possibly achieve. My own sister had broken into my personal email account simply to satisfy her need to challenge my credibility. Listening to her voice in that moment, full of satisfaction at what she considered a victory, I realized that the boundaries between us had finally been crossed in a way that couldn't be quietly ignored anymore. After the phone call, where Rachel casually admitted that she had accessed my private email, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving. The quiet of my apartment felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the strange violation of what had just happened. For most of my life, I had learned to tolerate Rachel's behavior by keeping a distance from her chaos. Her jokes, her mockery, even her constant need for attention were things I could usually ignore because they existed mostly in the background of my life. But this was different. Reading my private correspondence with my publisher had crossed a line that wasn't just rude or embarrassing. It was invasive in a way that made me realize she no longer respected any boundaries at all. I changed my email password that same night and added every security measure I could think of. The action felt practical, almost mechanical, like locking the door after discovering someone had already been inside the house. I told myself that the situation would calm down now, that she had proven whatever point she believed she needed to prove. Rachel had always been obsessed with winning arguments, and in her mind the fact that my book deal existed was apparently some kind of victory she could claim involvement in. For about 24 hours, nothing unusual happened. Then things became much worse. I first noticed it when one of my coworkers mentioned something strange the following afternoon. I was in the teacher's lounge at school, grading a stack of essays, when he casually asked how my big publishing contract was going. His tone sounded friendly, but slightly amused, like he had read something unexpected online. That question alone didn't seem alarming because a few friends and colleagues already knew about the book deal. But the way he described it felt oddly specific. He said he'd seen screenshots. The moment he said that word, a cold feeling settled in my stomach. After my last class ended that day, I opened my phone and checked social media. Rachel's profile appeared near the top of my feed, and the moment I opened it, I felt the same stunned disbelief I had experienced during our phone call the night before. She had posted screenshots of my contract. Not the entire document, but enough pieces of it that the details were obvious. The advance amount, the publisher's name, sections of the payment schedule, and even a portion of the signature page were visible in the images she uploaded. Anyone scrolling through her page could clearly see that the information came directly from a private legal agreement. Above the screenshots, she had written a caption that instantly made my jaw tighten. She announced to her followers that she was incredibly proud of her little brother and that she had helped him build his brand from the beginning. The words sat there publicly for hundreds of people to read, presented with the kind of enthusiasm that made it look like she was celebrating a shared accomplishment. Friends of hers were already commenting underneath the post with congratulations, emojis, and messages praising Rachel for supporting a writer in the family. I had never given her permission to share any of that information. In fact, until that moment, I had intentionally kept the details of the contract fairly private. My agent and publisher had both advised discretion until the official announcement later in the year. Rachel had ignored that entirely, treating my professional agreement like it was promotional material for her own social media performance. I immediately called her. When she answered, her voice sounded excited rather than apologetic, as if she expected me to thank her for the publicity. She started explaining that she was simply helping spread the news and that exposure was good for my career. The tone of her voice carried the same smug confidence she always used when she believed she was doing something clever. I told her very clearly that she had no right to post any of that. Instead of apologizing, she laughed. She said that family should support each other and that I should be grateful someone was helping promote my work. The conversation quickly turned into another one of those circular arguments Rachel loved, where she reframed every criticism as proof that she was actually being generous. I ended the call before it went any further. Over the next day, the situation escalated in ways I could never have predicted. More posts appeared on her accounts, each one presenting herself as the person responsible for guiding my supposed literary career. She wrote long captions about how she had always believed in my talent and how she had helped shape my public image behind the scenes. None of it was true, but Rachel didn't seem interested in truth. She was interested in narrative, and the version she created placed her directly in the center of my success. The most disturbing part came when I discovered something else she had built. A former classmate of mine sent me a message containing a link to a website. At first, I assumed it was some kind of fan page or promotional blog connected to my publisher. When I opened it, I realized almost immediately that Rachel was responsible. The site was titled with my name in large lettering, followed by a phrase that made my stomach twist. The Ethan Caldwell Experience. The entire website looked like a self-made marketing page, filled with dramatic language about storytelling, literary impact, and upcoming projects that had never been publicly announced. My photograph had been taken from an old social media profile and placed at the top like a promotional banner. But the most shocking part wasn't the design or the exaggerated language. It was the section where Rachel described herself. She had listed her own name under a heading label management and representation. The text underneath claimed that she served as my personal manager and brand strategist, responsible for coordinating opportunities related to my writing career. Reading those words felt surreal. I had never agreed to anything like that. There had never been a conversation about representation, management, or branding. My actual literary agent handled those responsibilities professionally through proper channels. Rachel had simply inserted herself into the narrative. To anyone who didn't know the real situation, the website made it appear as though she had been working behind the scenes guiding my career. It was the ultimate extension of the same pattern she had followed her entire life, taking someone else's moment and pulling it into the spotlight she believed belonged to her. Except this time, it wasn't just an embarrassing family story. She had taken private documents, posted them publicly, and constructed an entire public identity around the idea that my success somehow existed because of her. When I finished reading through the website Rachel had created using my name, I closed the laptop and sat quietly at the kitchen table for several minutes. The reaction she probably expected from me was anger, or at least panic. Rachel had spent her entire life provoking emotional reactions from people because strong reactions gave her control over the situation. If someone yelled, she could claim they were overreacting. If someone argued, she could twist the conversation until the original problem disappeared inside a new dramatic story. For most of my life, I had avoided those traps by staying quiet. This time, however, the silence came from a very different place. I wasn't confused about what needed to happen. I wasn't even particularly emotional about it anymore. What Rachel had done was no longer just embarrassing family behavior. She had publicly shared private contract information, misrepresented herself as my professional representative, and attached her name to something that had legal and financial implications. That kind of situation didn't require a family argument. It required a lawyer. I picked up my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number of someone I hadn't spoken to in a few months. Jessica Monroe and I had met years earlier through a mutual friend when she was still finishing law school. Over time, we had stayed loosely in touch, mostly exchanging occasional messages about books or work. She specialized in intellectual property law, which at the time had simply sounded like an interesting field she was passionate about. Now it suddenly felt extremely relevant. When she answered the phone, I calmly explained the situation from the beginning. I described the email breach, the screenshots Rachel had posted online, and the website where she had listed herself as my manager. Jessica listened without interrupting for most of the conversation, occasionally asking for small clarifications about dates or screenshots. Her reaction was very different from the emotional responses I had received from friends who had already seen the situation unfolding online. She sounded focused. At one point, she quietly asked if I had copies of everything Rachel had posted. I told her I had already saved screenshots of the social media posts and the website pages earlier that morning. Something about Rachel's behavior had triggered the same observational instinct that had shaped my entire life, the quiet habit of documenting things carefully before reacting. Jessica told me to send everything to her immediately. I forwarded the files while we were still on the phone. There was a short silence as she looked through them, and when she spoke again, her tone carried a level of professional clarity that made the entire situation suddenly feel less chaotic. She explained that what Rachel had done created several serious legal problems. Accessing my private email without permission could fall under unauthorized account access, depending on how she obtained the login information. Posting portions of a confidential publishing contract publicly could violate privacy agreements. Creating a website where she falsely presented herself as my professional manager while using my name for promotion introduced issues related to identity misuse and potential misrepresentation. Listening to her calmly outline those points made something click in my mind. For years, Rachel had treated boundaries like suggestions that could be ignored if she was confident enough. She had spent most of her life manipulating social situations where the consequences rarely extended beyond awkward family arguments. But legal boundaries were different. They existed outside her ability to charm, argue, or dominate a conversation. Jessica asked if I wanted to pursue formal action. I told her I simply wanted the situation stopped immediately and permanently. I had no interest in turning it into a long public conflict, but I also had no intention of letting Rachel continue using my name and professional work as material for her personal performances. Jessica told me she would handle it over the next 3 days. She moved with a level of efficiency that made the situation feel almost surreal. While Rachel continued posting enthusiastic updates about my supposed brand development on her social media accounts, Jessica quietly began preparing the legal response. First, she drafted a formal cease and desist letter addressed directly to Rachel. The document outlined several violations related to privacy, misrepresentation, and unauthorized use of my name in connection with commercial promotion. It demanded the immediate removal of the website, the deletion of the contract screenshots, and a public clarification that Rachel had no professional affiliation with my work. At the same time, Jessica began filing paperwork to secure trademark protection for my author name. She explained that while many writers publish under their own names without formal registration, the situation with Rachel made it wise to establish clear legal ownership over the use of my name in connection with publishing and promotional activities. Within 72 hours, everything was ready. The cease and desist letter was delivered through official legal channels along with documentation explaining the potential legal consequences if the demands were ignored. Jessica also included formal notice regarding the trademark filings and a warning about identity misuse connected to the website Rachel had created. I didn't contact Rachel during any of this. I didn't send angry messages or argue with her online. I simply went to work each day, taught my classes, and continued grading essays in the evenings while the legal process moved quietly in the background. Late on the third day, my phone finally rang. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. When I answered, the change in her voice was immediate and unmistakable. The confident amusement she usually carried had disappeared completely. Instead, there was a tight, nervous edge beneath her words, the sound of someone realizing that the game they thought they were playing had suddenly become something else. She asked why a lawyer had contacted her. I told her calmly that the letter explained everything. For a moment, she tried to laugh it off the way she always did when she felt challenged, but the laughter faded quickly. Legal documents didn't respond to charm or volume. They didn't become confused during arguments or distracted by emotional performances. For the first time in her life, Rachel was facing a situation she couldn't manipulate simply by talking louder than everyone else in the room, and the silence on the other end of the phone made it very clear that she had finally realized it. Once the legal process began moving forward, my daily life became surprisingly quiet again. The tension that had built up during those chaotic weeks slowly faded as the situation shifted away from emotional confrontation and into formal channels handled by professionals. Jessica kept me updated on the progress, explaining that Rachel had removed the website within a few days of receiving the cease and desist letter and had begun deleting the posts containing the screenshots from my publishing contract. The change was abrupt enough that it almost felt unreal, like someone had suddenly turned off a loud machine that had been running in the background for years. Instead of following the drama online or thinking about what Rachel might do next, I returned my attention to the things that had always mattered more to me than family conflicts. My work. Teaching had never been something I treated as temporary or secondary, even after the publishing deal was finalized. Every morning, I still arrived at school early, usually before most of the students had even reached the building, and prepare my lessons with the same quiet focus I had developed over the years. There was something grounding about standing in front of a classroom discussing literature with teenagers who were still discovering how powerful stories could be. The difference now was that my writing life was beginning to grow alongside my teaching career instead of existing quietly in the evenings. With Jessica's advice and my publisher's support, I created an official author website under my own control. Unlike the strange promotional page Rachel had built without permission, this one felt simple and honest. It included information about the novel, a short biography about my background as a teacher, and a small section where readers could follow updates about future projects. I didn't try to turn it into some kind of exaggerated brand platform. I just wanted a place where people who enjoyed the book could learn more about it without confusion. The response from readers started slowly at first, mostly through emails from people who had received early copies of the manuscript through the publisher's advanced review program. Many of them talked about how the themes of the story connected with their own experiences growing up feeling overlooked or underestimated. Reading those messages felt surreal because the novel had started as something deeply personal, written alone at my kitchen table, without any expectation that strangers might one day see themselves in it. Around that time, I also began receiving invitations from a few schools that had heard about the book through education networks. Some of them were small public schools with limited budgets, places where creative writing programs barely existed because funding was usually directed toward more immediate academic needs. Those invitations quickly became one of the most meaningful parts of the experience. Whenever my schedule allowed, I traveled to those schools and ran small writing workshops for students. The sessions were simple. We talked about storytelling, character development, and the strange way writing allows people to organize complicated emotions into something understandable. Many of the students were hesitant at first, but once they started sharing ideas, the room usually filled with the kind of energy that only appears when people realize their voices actually matter. Standing in those classrooms reminded me why I had become a teacher in the first place. During one of those visits, a local media student who had been documenting community education programs asked if he could interview me about the transition from teacher to published author. The project eventually grew into a short documentary about writing, education, and the quiet paths people sometimes take toward creative work. The filming process was casual and surprisingly comfortable. Instead of dramatic interviews or staged scenes, the student followed me through normal moments of my routine. He filmed parts of my classroom lessons, small segments of the workshops at underfunded schools, and a few conversations where I talked about growing up as the quiet sibling who spent most of his time observing the world instead of competing for attention. When the documentary was finished, it was posted online through a small educational channel that normally attracted a modest audience. None of us expected what happened next. Within a few weeks, the video began spreading across social media in a way that felt completely unexpected. Teachers shared it with other educators, writing communities passed it around as an example of perseverance, and students began leaving comments about how the story reminded them that success didn't always come from the loudest person in the room. The view count climbed rapidly. Watching the numbers increase each day felt strange because the video didn't contain anything sensational or dramatic. It was simply a quiet story about patience, writing, and the influence teachers can have on students who are still trying to understand themselves. Yet somehow that quiet message connected with people. The viral attention eventually reached places far beyond education circles. Journalists began contacting my publisher for interviews about the novel and the documentary. Book sales increased steadily, and messages from readers arrived faster than I could respond to them. Several months later, something happened that none of us had predicted when the book was first published. My literary agent called me one afternoon while I was leaving school after a long day of grading essays. Her voice carried the careful excitement she used whenever she had important news, but wanted to explain it properly before celebrating. She told me that a streaming studio had recently watched the documentary and read the novel shortly afterward. They were interested in adapting the story into a limited television series. Hearing those words while standing in the quiet hallway outside my classroom felt surreal in a way that was difficult to describe. For most of my life, I had built things slowly in the background without expecting recognition, focusing on the process rather than the outcome. Now the story that began as a personal project written late at night had somehow grown into something much larger than I ever imagined in the months that followed. The strange storm Rachel had created around my life slowly collapsed under its own weight. The legal pressure from Jessica's letter had forced her to dismantle the things she built using my name much faster than she ever expected. The website she had proudly launched disappeared almost overnight, leaving nothing behind except a blank domain page that eventually went offline entirely. The posts containing my contract screenshots vanished from her social media accounts as well, although not before enough people had already seen them and started asking questions she clearly wasn't prepared to answer. At first, Rachel tried to present the situation as if everything had been a misunderstanding. She wrote a short statement claiming that she had only been helping promote a family member's success, framing the entire situation like an overreaction on my part rather than acknowledging what she had actually done. That explanation might have worked if the story had stayed within a small circle of relatives and friends, but the internet has a way of preserving details longer than people expect. Screenshots of her earlier posts circulated quietly among readers who had followed the documentary and the early coverage of my book. Some of them noticed the contradiction between her public claims of being my manager and the official information published by my literary agent and the publisher. Once people began comparing those details, the narrative Rachel had tried to build started unraveling piece by piece. For someone who had spent most of her life chasing attention, the shift in the tone of that attention seemed to hit her harder than anything else. Instead of admiration or curiosity, the comments under her posts slowly turned skeptical. Some people asked simple questions about why a professional author would need a family member secretly reading his email to verify a publishing contract. Others pointed out that sharing private legal documents online without permission wasn't the kind of supportive behavior she described. The internet rarely forgets contradictions, and Rachel had left too many of them behind. The online attention she had always craved began transforming into something she clearly didn't want. Criticism replaced praise. I didn't participate in any of those conversations. I never posted explanations or tried to publicly defend myself because the truth was already visible through the documentation Jessica had prepared and the official announcements coming from my publisher. The situation resolved itself simply by existing in the open, without the dramatic arguments Rachel usually relied on to control narrative. While that was happening, my own life continued moving forward in the quiet, steady rhythm it had always followed. The book reached readers in more countries as translation agreements were finalized, and the discussions about adapting it for television slowly progressed through the complicated development process that the entertainment industry requires. My agent kept me informed about those conversations, but she also reminded me not to build expectations around things that could take years to materialize. Most days still looked remarkably normal. I continued waking up early, driving to school, and standing in front of classrooms filled with students who were discovering literature for the first time. We talked about novels, short stories, and the ways people use writing to understand themselves and the world around them. Some afternoons, I stayed late helping students revise essays or discussing college applications with seniors who were nervous about the future. In the evenings, I wrote. That routine never changed because it had never depended on fame or attention in the first place. Writing had always been something I did quietly, usually with a cup of coffee beside my laptop, in the kind of silence that allows ideas to settle into sentences. From time to time, I heard small updates about Rachel through relatives. The situation with her online persona had created tension in her personal life as well. Her husband, who had mostly stayed in the background during the earlier chaos, eventually left after months of arguments that seemed to revolve around the same patterns Rachel had followed for years. The details weren't something I felt interested in exploring deeply because by that point I had already spent enough energy thinking about her choices. What mattered more was the strange sense of clarity that emerged from the entire experience. For most of my life, my identity inside the family had always been defined through comparison. I was the quiet one, the calm one, the younger brother who existed somewhere behind Rachel's louder personality. Even when I built a stable career and finished writing a novel, that comparison lingered in subtle ways during family gatherings or conversations with relatives who still remembered us as children. But something changed after everything unfolded. The book, the documentary, The workshops at schools and the slow growth of my writing career created a space where my name stood on its own without needing to be explained through anyone else's story. People who read the novel or watched the documentary didn't know me as someone's younger sibling. They knew me as the teacher who wrote a book about perseverance and observation. For the first time in my life, introductions felt different. When people talked about my work, they simply used my name. Not Rachel's brother, not the quiet kid from the background, just Ethan Caldwell. And strangely enough, that quiet recognition felt far more meaningful than any spotlight Rachel had spent her life chasing.